The transformation of an INFJ into a Sigma version of themselves rarely happens suddenly. It is almost always the result of a slow internal buildup, experiences, pressures, realizations, and emotional shifts accumulating beneath the surface until something finally pushes them into a radically different way of operating. When this happens, the INFJ, who is usually empathetic, collaborative, and harmony-driven, begins to detach from all external expectations. They retreat into the most self-contained version of their personality, one where their intuitive insight becomes colder, sharper, and more strategic. Their independence becomes sacred, and their emotional boundaries become impenetrable. One of the strongest triggers for this shift is emotional betrayal or deep disappointment. INFJs invest in people on a level most personalities never fully understand. They give their insight, their loyalty, their emotional labor, and their spiritual sensitivity. When someone violates that trust, dismisses their vulnerability, or repeatedly overlooks their efforts, something inside them snaps. The betrayal burns away their idealism, leaving behind clarity and self-preservation. In Sigma mode, INFJs no longer offer their emotional energy freely. Instead, they observe from a distance, trusting only their intuition and withdrawing into a self-directed inner world where others no longer have the privilege of access. If you want to truly understand yourself and unlock your full potential as an INFJ, check out the INFJ Purpose Compass today. The link is in the description of this video. Another major catalyst is prolonged overstimulation or exhaustion. INFJs can seem calm and composed externally, but internally they are processing thousands of emotional, psychological, and relational cues every second. When they are overwhelmed by chaotic environments, demanding people, or non-stop obligations, they reach a point where they must shut everything down to survive. This is not simple introversion. It is a complete energetic recalibration. They step out of the social ecosystem and move into a solitary, minimalist psychological space where they no longer respond to emotional pulls or external noise. This is when they become laser-focused, self-contained, and unusually unbothered by outside expectations. A third and often underestimated trigger is having their mission or personal values threatened. INFJs live with a strong internal compass. Their sense of purpose is not casual, it is sacred. When someone pressures them to abandon their authenticity, compromise their morals, or move in a direction that conflicts with their intuition, INFJs stop explaining themselves. Instead, they move silently, firmly, and decisively. Sigma INFJ mode is not rebellious, it is protective. They detach from anyone who tries to control them, and they begin to prioritize self-determination over harmony. Their internal world becomes the only world that matters, and they trust themselves more than any external authority. The Sigma transformation can also be triggered by the realization that they have been undervalued. INFJs often feel unseen because much of their strength is subtle. Emotional intelligence, foresight, deep understanding, and intuitive problem solving. When people take them for granted or assume their efforts require no recognition, INFJs eventually stop offering those strengths. They retreat, pouring all that energy into their personal goals instead. Their independence grows. Their boundaries sharpen. They stop waiting for validation and instead create a life where they no longer need it. This is usually when they become intimidating without meaning to be. Their quiet confidence and emotional self-sufficiency radiate power. Another profound trigger comes from internal growth or awakening. INFJs have periodic spiritual or psychological breakthroughs, moments when their intuition reveals a truth they cannot ignore. These realizations reshape them. They begin to see through patterns, people, and illusions that once confused them. When this happens, they detach naturally, not from pain but from evolution. They outgrow environments, relationships, and versions of themselves that no longer fit. Sigma mode becomes a cocoon for transformation, a stage where they rebuild their identity with stronger boundaries and clearer priorities. Another trigger is the desire to reinvent themselves after a long period of self-sacrifice. INFJs often give too much, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. When they realize they have been draining themselves for others, they shift into a phase of radical self-focus. They pull back their energy, stop rescuing people, and stop explaining their decisions. Suddenly, they become unpredictable, unconventional, and self-directed. This version of the INFJ moves silently toward personal goals, cutting off distractions and rewriting their destiny without seeking anyone's input. Conflict or manipulation can also activate their Sigma mode. INFJs often avoid confrontation because it disrupts harmony, but when pushed into a corner or when they detect manipulation, their normally gentle intuition transforms into something sharper. They become analytical, emotionally detached, and strategically observant. They see the motives behind people's actions with chilling clarity. Instead of reacting emotionally, they act with precision, setting boundaries that are final and non-negotiable. In Sigma mode, they are not swayed by guilt, pressure, or emotional games. They rise above it, quietly removing themselves from any situation that feels toxic. The need for complete creative freedom is another trigger. INFJs are visionaries at heart. They thrive when they have space to develop ideas, build projects, and explore their imagination without interference. When they feel restricted, controlled, or boxed in, they break away from the system entirely. They begin to work alone, trusting their own methods, instincts, and timing. Their independence becomes a creative force. Their inner world becomes a laboratory of innovation, where they produce their best ideas without outside influence diluting their vision. Another subtle but powerful trigger is recognizing how different they are from others. INFJs often spend much of their life trying to blend in or meet social expectations. But with maturity comes the realization that their mind operates on a completely different wavelength. Once they embrace this difference instead of resisting it, they stop seeking external belonging. They build their own path, follow their own rhythm, and adopt a lone wolf mentality. In Sigma mode, they feel strangely free, no longer burdened by the need to fit into social structures that never respected their complexity. Another trigger is a longing for peace so deep that it overrides every other consideration. When the INFJ's soul feels heavy from emotional noise, social obligations, or relational chaos, they silently withdraw into a highly protected version of themselves. Here, peace becomes their priority. They eliminate people who disturb their mental clarity. They cut out environments that feel draining. They reduce their emotional availability. This version of the INFJ is calm, observant, quiet, and self-possessed, like someone who has stepped outside the world to watch it from a distance. When these triggers activate the Sigma INFJ mode, it is the INFJ stepping into a version of themselves that is stronger, clearer, more self-reliant, deeply intuitive, and fully aligned with their inner truth. They become someone who moves quietly but powerfully, someone who chooses solitude not out of pain but out of purpose, someone who no longer needs external validation to feel complete. The Sigma INFJ is an INFJ who has finally learned how to protect their energy, honor their insight, and walk their path with unapologetic independence. Another trigger that can shift an INFJ into their Sigma state is the moment they finally recognize their own emotional limits. INFJs often push themselves far beyond what is healthy, believing they should always be available, always supportive, always understanding. But when they hit a point where their emotional reserves run dry, something irreversible happens. They become acutely aware that they cannot sustain this level of giving without damaging themselves. This realization forces them to pull back abruptly, retreating into solitude where they can rebuild their internal equilibrium. In Sigma mode, they stop apologizing for their boundaries and begin honoring their emotional thresholds with a fierce protectiveness. As they retract into themselves, they often experience a second trigger, a sudden craving for intellectual autonomy. INFJs are deep thinkers, but they frequently soften or contain their thoughts to avoid intimidating others or seeming too intense. When they decide to stop filtering their mind, the shift is dramatic. Their inner world becomes a sanctuary where they can think expansively, question everything, challenge assumptions, and rebuild their worldview without interference. This intellectual freedom awakens a stronger, more self-assured version of the INFJ, one who no longer needs external affirmation to trust their insights. This naturally leads to another profound trigger, the realization that solitude enhances their strength rather than diminishing it. INFJs often feel pressure to be present, social, and emotionally available. But when they spend extended time alone, free from external emotional demands, they begin to understand how deeply solitude fuels their clarity, creativity, and intuition. They no longer see isolation as loneliness, but as liberation. In Sigma mode, they actively choose this solitude, seeing it as the environment where they develop the most powerful versions of their ideas and decisions. Another situation that triggers this shift is the exposure of hidden patterns within relationships. INFJs observe quietly, often noticing inconsistencies or subtle manipulations long before they acknowledge them consciously. But when they finally connect the dots and see the deeper truth, especially if someone's intentions were not genuine, they detach instantly. This detachment isn't emotional, it's strategic. It marks the moment they stop trying to save, heal, or understand the person and start prioritizing their own psychological freedom. In Sigma mode, they trust their perception completely and remove themselves from relationships that operate on anything less than honesty. The next trigger unfolds when an INFJ recognizes the power of selective access. In their typical state, they may allow too many people into their emotional world, believing that openness fosters connection. But after being drained or misunderstood repeatedly, they begin to see the importance of granting access only to those who have earned it. They become highly intentional with their energy, allowing very few people to know them deeply. Sigma INFJs operate with an inner circle so small that it becomes nearly impossible for outsiders to influence or destabilize them. This newfound selectivity then leads into another transformation, the refusal to participate in anything superficial. INFJs can adapt socially, but that adaptability is often a survival strategy rather than a reflection of their true preferences. When they enter Sigma mode, this adaptation stops. Surface-level conversations, shallow relationships, performative behavior, and emotionally empty environments no longer hold any interest. They withdraw from anything that does not nourish their spirit or stimulate their mind, seeking meaning and authenticity in every area of their life. Another powerful trigger comes from a sudden burst of long-term vision. INFJs periodically experience intuitive surges, moments when they see their future direction with stunning clarity. When such a vision hits, their priorities reorganize instantly. They detach from distractions, obligations, and people who no longer fit the trajectory of where they are going. The Sigma INFJ becomes highly focused, almost monk-like in their discipline, moving silently toward goals that may remain invisible to everyone else but feel inevitable to them. This vision-driven shift often pairs with a growing intolerance for emotional chaos. INFJs are naturally empathetic, but they can only absorb so much disorganization, unpredictability, or irrational behavior before their inner world begins to suffer. When the emotional environment around them becomes too unstable, they activate their Sigma state as a form of inner stabilization. They stop absorbing other people's feelings and instead observe from a distance, choosing serenity over involvement. Their energy becomes calm, self-contained and grounded, even when everything around them is chaotic. Another subtle but significant trigger is the realization that not everyone deserves full emotional transparency. INFJs instinctively communicate with depth and honesty, but this openness can expose them to people who misuse their vulnerability. When the INFJ finally understands that emotional honesty must be earned, not offered freely, they begin to operate with a controlled, strategic form of authenticity. They no longer reveal their inner world impulsively. Instead, they share selectively and deliberately, creating an air of mystery that naturally aligns with their Sigma nature. As this inner transformation progresses, INFJs also become triggered by the desire to master their own identity without external influence. They grow tired of being defined by roles, expectations, or the emotional demands of others. This hunger for self-authorship becomes a catalyst for profound psychological independence. In Sigma mode, the INFJ begins rewriting their self-concept from scratch, deciding who they want to be based solely on their internal values and intuitive alignment. This identity shift is one of the strongest and most enduring triggers of the Sigma transformation. The final trigger in this progression comes when the INFJ realizes that silence can be more powerful than explanation. INFJs often exhaust themselves trying to make others understand their feelings, motives, or boundaries. But in Sigma mode, they stop over-explaining completely. They let their decisions stand without justification. They let their boundaries speak for themselves. Their silence becomes a shield, a form of confidence, and a declaration of inner authority. This silence is not passive. It is intentional, disciplined, and deeply empowering. It marks the moment when the INFJ steps fully into their Sigma identity, guided by intuition, protected by boundaries, and anchored in self-possession. Another trigger that pushes an INFJ into their Sigma state is the moment they finally understand the emotional cost of constantly being the strong one. INFJs often take on the unspoken role of emotional anchor in their relationships, steadying others, offering clarity, absorbing tension, and providing comfort even when they themselves are depleted. But when they recognize how deeply this role has drained them, they withdraw from it entirely. They stop volunteering emotional labor and begin reclaiming their inner space. This withdrawal isn't coldness, it's self-correction. In Sigma mode, they refuse to carry what isn't theirs, placing their own emotional well-being above the expectations that once defined them. This awakening naturally leads to another powerful shift, the desire to build a life that no longer depends on anyone's approval or emotional consistency. Once INFJs realize how unpredictable people's support can be, they begin constructing an inner and outer life that is stable regardless of who stays or leaves. They invest in their skills, passions, solitude, and spiritual grounding. They become their own source of validation and their own emotional foundation. This self-sufficiency strengthens their Sigma identity, allowing them to move through the world with a calm, detached confidence that is rooted not in isolation, but in the deep realization that their peace is something they must cultivate and protect for themselves.